All right, well, this week on Behind the Headlines, we're talking about the $6 million blunder, which was, of course, our cover story this week about the raises and bonuses that will be given to Palo Alto Unified teachers and classified employees, despite the Board of Education's decision last fall that these raises should be canceled because of the budget shortfall. I think there's some key concepts that we need to go over, maybe to kind of solidify this conversation before we have it. Certainly one of the factors is the multi-year contract. Elena, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So the school board approved this. I think it's supposed to be the first ever 3-year contract with the teachers and classified unions. So instead of negotiating throughout the entire school year and then giving retroactive raises, they planned out the next 3 years with significant raises. The contract also planned for some unpredictability in property taxes, which is sort of what came to pass last summer, with some safety valve provisions that the district could fall back on if property tax came in lower than they had anticipated. So,
Which it did to the tune of $3.7 million.
Right. So that was almost a year ago, last summer, when the district discovered that they were going to have far less money in the budget, given the difference between the property tax projections and what they had planned for.
Yeah. And the school board kind of immediately looked at the safety valve provision, which was going to apply this year to roll back those raises as 3% raise and then an additional 1% bonus. So they're going to get a 1% bonus, and then it would be a 2% bonus if property taxes.
Yeah, maybe we can explain that later.
There's a lot.
Confusing.
It's
There's a lot
technical
in the contract, but
kind of thing.
Basically, given what happened last year, it was assumed as early in draft budgets as last summer in late August, that there would be no raises for the 2017-18 school year, and that was the operating assumption for the board members, and it sounds like for staff, but not for the union.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about this situation, which came to light publicly last Friday through Superintendent Max McGee's weekly email, is that it was phrased as kind of good news. There's good news, the teachers are getting raises, classified employees are getting raises, $4.4 million worth, but that wasn't really what was happening.
Yeah, so Max posted, he has a weekly message that goes on the website every Friday, and there was an initial version of it that was posted. He said, the latest figures from the county indicate that property tax is coming in 6.5% compared to the district's estimate of 3.73%, which they intentionally made very conservative so that they would get this good news basically this year. We had estimated a 3.8 increase this year, so the increase in tax revenue amounts to about $4.4 million above our estimates. These funds will be used to provide a 3% increase to the teaching staff and classified staff, which amounts to $4.417 million. Later that day, he added 2 more sentences, and this is what he added. While we would have preferred to have more flexibility if we reopened the 2017-18 contract, due to some misunderstanding and misinterpretation of the contract language, we missed this opportunity. This caused some confusion, but the union and district leadership worked through it, and we are moving forward. So this, I think, was actually confusing in itself to anyone who didn't have the background knowledge of what had been going on. And when I talked to Max about it on Friday, he said, I wanted to put this out as soon as possible in public, but I think that this was actually not really explaining, as our reporting shows, what had gone on before this point.
Yeah. And you immediately zeroed in on these phrases, misunderstanding, confusion, and it took a lot of effort to try to unpack what confusion was there between the district and the union. It seemed pretty spelled out. The board seemed to be pretty much on board with canceling the raises, and then there's apparently some confusion going on.
Yeah, and the contract is very clear. I mean, what had to happen this spring in March, by March 15th, 2017, which is in the contract, was that negotiations would be formally reopened. And it seems like everyone was operating under the assumption that because it was mentioned at board meetings, there were no raises in the budget plans, that everyone assumed that was, you didn't have to formally reopen it, including Scott Bowers, who's the lead negotiator at the time, said that he had conversations with the union at the beginning of the school year, and he was regretful that he didn't provide a formal notice to them, which he afterwards realized he should have by that March deadline.
Yeah.
I think the striking thing about the superintendent's update was the fact that The original version of that not only was as brief as you read and talked about the fact that the teachers were going to get this increase, but it was buried in the middle of the update. So it was really presented as an insignificant announcement about what was going to be possible as a result of this yet to be determined, really, property tax windfall this year. And then it was only really after your inquiries and perhaps the inquiries of others that the paragraph was added that I guess attempted to tie this back to the union contract, but without any real explanation. So any member of the public would have no way to understand the ramifications of this, and certainly no way to understand that we're talking about a $6 million obligation that the district has now incurred that wasn't budgeted, wasn't planned for, and would have been avoided simply by meeting this deadline of notifying the unions by March 15th.
Yeah, so one thing that I'm trying to figure out is that the union said that they weren't aware of the issue, this discrepancy of they weren't going to get the raises. They weren't aware of that till August. Now, aren't they sitting in on board meetings throughout the year? Aren't they paying attention to the budgeting process?
Yeah, the president of the teachers union, Terry Baldwin, and the president of the classified union, Meb Steiner, are at almost every board meeting. They're always sitting in the back. They were at all of the budget conversations throughout this entire year when the board was making really challenging budget cuts.
There are like more than a dozen meetings since last
there
year.
are numerous opportunities and numerous times that the plan for the budget for this year was presented with no raises. So it's hard to imagine that this hadn't occurred to them. But they did say that they realized in August, I think, when they got maybe their first paychecks for the year.
I think this may be the biggest mystery that we've yet to uncover about this whole thing, because it just doesn't make any sense that the union leadership, which pops up regularly to object to cutbacks and to defend teachers against being cut back, to that sort of thing, that they could possibly, it just strains credibility to think that they went through 6 months of thinking that their raises were coming as expected with everything that preceded it.
And there was no pushback. I mean, there's no indication that they thought maybe it was going to happen, that there's some glimmer of hope was discussed at any board meeting about how.
I think there are probably references to, if property tax comes in higher, then we'll have that conversation, which then the board could have had that conversation at this point if they were still assuming zero raises.
Yeah.
The board president, Terry Godfrey, has said, if this hadn't happened, we would be now talking about how to use that additional $4.4 million, and potentially there could have been some raise. It probably wouldn't have been as large as 3%, but that was what she thought would happen at this point.
Yeah, but certainly that conversation had not happened up till now, and still hasn't happened.
Yeah.
So one of the key figures is Scott Bowers. He's now retired. He's left the district. He was the associate superintendent, the lead negotiator for the union. For the district with the union. So what does he say about the March 15th deadline? He knew about it. He didn't know about it.
He said, he had these conversations with the unions at the start of the year. It sounded like he wasn't really aware of meeting that deadline formally. He had those conversations before March 15th. He said when he left in June, he was unaware that this was any sort of issue. And he said that he didn't have conversations with the superintendent about it, nor with Kathy Mack, who's the chief budget officer, who is responsible for putting together the budget over the course of the entire year.
It seems like people are certainly pointing fingers at Scott Bowers, maybe conveniently, saying that Kathy Mack had said that she had reminded him. She volunteered that information this month in a closed session meeting.
Kathy Mack, chief budget officer for the school district.
Yes, yeah. That she had reminded him, and then Mack said he was not part of negotiations at that level. And even the board didn't seem to have any kind of feedback mechanism going on, such that if they had thought the negotiations were going on from March 15th through.
Yeah, it's really remarkable, the picture that's been painted here from your reporting, because what it really shows is that everybody was operating under the assumption, including Scott Bowers, the union negotiator and superintendent, that we've talked about this so much that it was plainly clear what our decision was, what our intention was. We talked about the fact that these third-year raises were not going to go into effect, but nobody then focused on the very clear language of the contract, a contract that Scott negotiated and that the Superintendent McGee was pushing for. He got this 3-year contract that he wanted with this safety valve. Nobody was focusing on the fact that it spelled out very clear process for how one goes about reopening the negotiations and therefore canceling the raises, which is wait until the February statement from the assessor's office that sort of finalizes how far off the property tax budget we were, and that if it's more than a certain amount, then notice needs to be given to the union by March 15th. And everybody was operating under this impression that the board members, superintendent, apparently Kathy Mack, Scott Bowers, that everybody's on the same page here.
And I think it's compounded by the fact, particularly for some board members, that, you know, a large budget crisis already happened the previous summer, and so it felt like, you know, that misstep happened. We should have been double, triple checking everything that had to do with the budget over the course of this year, particularly when they were, you know, there were so many conversations about the difficult cuts that had to be made, and that it did, you know, people lost their positions, cuts were made relatively close to the classroom. So I think that just on top of what happened last year, it was added to it.
Well, and then they were working with a budget during the whole first part of this year that needed to be adopted at the end of June, and all of those draft budgets contained $0 for salary increases. So that's what was being presented to the board. I think in some ways that may have put it off their radar because they were probably assuming everything had gone as planned. And, but how it would be that nobody, including Kathy Mack, Max McGee, or board members, wouldn't have said along the way, so how did it go with the process of, you know, reopening the third year of the contract?
Yeah. The one thing that's astounding to me too is the union, but the unions this month met with Max McGee. I guess September 1st today, so it was last month. Met with Max to figure out what to do about this situation, but they had really. One of them had filed a grievance already.
The classified union.
Yeah. And the grievance about the situation of, you know, not getting the raises. Actually, we're assuming that. I mean, we're assuming
No, it was confirmed.
It was
yeah,
acknowledged
confirmed.
by the
district.
school district.
Yeah.
They wouldn't provide us with a copy of it, but they acknowledged receiving.
Okay.
Yeah, so they filed a grievance pretty quickly after they said they discovered this and then said that they worked it out.
Yeah, and although, you know, that's the formal process to file a grievance, I mean, it's somewhat shocking at the same time that there would be this incredible length of time from March 15th when they knew the deadline had been met to then, you know, it's saying absolutely nothing. Yeah. So I'm kind of curious about the difficulty that you had in reporting this story, because you certainly presented a very coherent, in-depth sketch of what all happened, but you were piecing this together from people remembering something happened, someone else not having an email. You know, there's a lot that went into that. I was hoping you could speak to that just a bit.
Yeah, and I think also clearly this was, you know, the way Max initially presented it wasn't really the full story, and I think everyone involved had an interest in characterizing it. I mean, the union also characterized it just as confusion and misunderstanding, and it was really hard to push past that.
We're all satisfied now, so everything's good.
Right, and there are still some unanswered questions, particularly about the union's role. But yeah, I mean, and speaking to each of these players as much as I could, you know, Kathy Mack was the only one really who wouldn't answer any specific questions to understand, instead of just getting third hand of, well, this is what we were told about, this is what Scott understood. So that was difficult to track down.
Yeah, and getting to Scott Bowers in retirement was a little bit tricky as well. Yeah.
I think one of the problems with a story like this, and this is fairly, for our viewers, this is pretty unusual in a story, that there was no person related to this story that had any interest in this story getting out. Everybody had their own reasons for not wanting this story to be told. Obviously, the unions got exactly what they wanted, and so the less said about it, the better from their standpoint. The school administrator, the district administrators, this was another embarrassing mistake. They would prefer that it not be known by the community. board members are kind of caught in the middle because they didn't know any of this was happening, and they haven't even been given the chance. And they were preempted in a sense by the superintendent's update, and they haven't even met since this occurred. So they're struggling with how to respond, and it's embarrassing to them as well. So who wants this story out? Nobody,
Right, yeah.
except the taxpayers of Palo Alto.
Sure, yeah. So Todd Collins, one of the Board of Education members, he's actually called for a closed session evaluation of Superintendent Max McGee. He's asked the board president for that. Hasn't been scheduled, I understand.
Yeah.
It sounds like he is perhaps the most critical of McGee and says that this is a hugely significant mistake, basically. So what do we, Max McGee's already said that he's going to retire at the end of this year.
Yeah.
So what do we know about, Max's future at this point, and what the board's stance is?
Yeah, I think it's unclear where the board stands, but certainly Todd Collins, just as one board member, has been repeatedly talking about compliance issues, and this being another example of that. There's been the sexual misconduct cases at Pali that were apparently mishandled. Then something, it's not small, but something like, getting the board minutes posted in a timely manner, which still is not happening. So sort of these, from the lowest level to the most extreme, these issues with just not paying attention to detail. And Todd has asked for sort of a compliance audit of the district. Max has agreed that needs to be done. That was at a recent board meeting. So, yeah, and I think there's, the argument can be made that Max is on his way out, so what is there to be done this year? Would that, be more disruptive for students in the district or the district office itself?
If the
after
board
a
were
lot
to
of
terminate him.
turnover. And it's also worth mentioning that there were a series of closed session evaluations of Max before he announced his retirement in June, and they ended with this sort of announcement where you had to read between the lines about his annual evaluation. And under his contract, the board is required to state publicly if it was a satisfactory evaluation, but they don't have to say so if it was unsatisfactory. And they just said that they accepted his evaluation. So
Okay, and didn't say it was satisfactory
No.
necessarily.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we should add to your list of the concerns that have been raised the most recent example, which was the salary increases that have not been approved publicly by the board as required by law for its senior people, which is not an insignificant mistake. I mean, the law clearly states that a board of trustees or a city council may not approve in closed session compensation for anybody, and that it must be done in open session. And as we've reported, that hasn't taken place now for 2 years with regards to McGee, nor has it been done for the other top people in several cases.
Yeah. I think it's a legitimate question for people to be asking as to what is the pro and con of McGee leaving now if the board were to terminate him or he were to resign versus keeping him on through the rest of the year, because certainly then there would be a leadership vacuum at the top. So I was wondering, Bill, if you could give us some thoughts on that. What would be kind of the trade-offs of having him leave now versus...
Yeah, well, I think it's an important thing to consider because, as you point out, there's going to be disruption with the departure of McGee if it happened immediately. My own opinion is that when something this serious occurs and the explanation of it is intentionally deceptive, which I think the facts speak for themselves in terms of how McGee attempted to deal with this problem, I think that just can't be tolerated. You can't have leading an organization someone who has shown in this one particular case, but also in many others, but in this particular case, has shown an inability or an unwillingness to be honest with the public about the circumstances that exist in this case. And the amount of controversy and drama that this school board has gone through in the last 2 years under this superintendent, I think it's the straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, I just think that that one has to take action if you're ever going to hold someone accountable. This is a perfect example of when it has to happen. Now, as to what then, I think like any organization, whether it be a for-profit business or a nonprofit, there are always going to be circumstances where you feel like you don't have a choice. You need to dismiss this person. I think this falls into that category, but for when that does occur, then there are ways that organizations deal with it. If they don't have people on their own staffs that are capable of stepping up and managing the day-to-day activities while a search takes place, then there are retired superintendents, there are retired executives that have the capability of coming in and operating a district like ours. I think that given the transition that our school district is needing to go through, another year of what we've been through is going to inflict way more damage than the benefit of starting now to rebuild, and to do that with the assistance of probably an outside person who would come in and make sure that the day-to-day operations of the district functions as they should.
Right. So it would give the district that many more months if the process were to start now, the transition process.
To find the right person.
To find someone, yeah.
And we also have, not that this is a solution, but there are a few people left that have history of this district. And Bob Golden, for example, is former business manager, has been around many years. We also could look to people that have served for this district in the past that may be retired. Scotty Lawrence would be one example of that, former Palo principal, former associate superintendent, former superintendent of what district was it, San Mateo that he was superintendent of, and recently retired. So these people are out there. I think it's a matter of accountability.
Okay.
Has that happened before in Palo Alto, or someone?
An interim superintendent? I don't think so. We've gone periods where a search is underway, I think, and you've got a little bit of a gap. But generally, school districts everywhere, the tradition is that whether they're getting rid of somebody or someone is retiring or resigning for another job, that this massive shift takes place in the spring when the new districts hire their new person who gives notice in their old district, and there's this big shuffle that takes place then over the summer. I think that system in itself is full of problems, and so I think this may be a huge advantage to our district to be looking sort of off that timetable.
Let's talk about the implications of this situation on the budget. First, we'll address the devil's advocate question, which is, so the property taxes have come in higher than expected. There is $4-point-something million.
May come in higher than expected.
Okay.
Projected
the
to come in.
estimate from the county so far, as of Wednesday, right? Is it
6.52%, I think.
Yeah.
Compared to 3.7.
Yeah.
It's about a $4 million sort of
$4 million.
what you might say is a windfall.
Yeah. So we've got the $4 million quote-unquote windfall, and then we have the $4.4 million raises. How can we...
And the $1.5 million additional bonus that's
Okay.
going to be paid.
That's part of the question. Is like, how can we just can't say, well, it's mostly a wash. We're
Well,
pretty
that's
good
what was
to-
attempted as when this got originally presented in the superintendent's update. It was presented as a wash.
Yeah. So I think the answer is the $1.5 million bonus, which it could probably come in.
Well, maybe we should explain that because it's
Yeah.
definitely coming in. We've wrestled with how to report on that.
Apparently coming in.
But do you want to explain how that the bonus
Try.
works?
So because the district budgeted so conservatively for this year because of what happened last year with the 3.73 property tax
Million, yeah.
rate, the growth rate. So, and they did that on purpose. There's a clause in the contract, and I think I can look at our chart here. If the property tax is greater than they budgeted for by 1.5% or more, the end of year bonus then doubles to 2%. So because they budgeted so conservatively, it's almost certain that will happen, and they have to wait until May to get a report from the county. But so that was another sort of
Well, and this is a snafu that's hard to just explain, which makes it hard to explain the significance of it. But the board is operating under the assumption that the contract has been nullified, because that's what for the pay increase for the third year.
Yeah.
So what they didn't really deal with is the fact that there's this bonus provision that wasn't directly part of canceling the raise. So the bonus provision remains in this contract. And by conservatively budgeting for this property tax increase, it really almost, and it will, I mean, we're going to be way above the 1.5% threshold for this extra bonus. So it sort of adds insult to injury in a sense, because we're not only, because of what's happened, obligated to pay the salary increases, but we're going to end up paying an additional bonus of $1.5 million that nobody really thought of. Nobody thought about the likelihood of that, and they didn't budget for it.
Yeah. What are the likely cuts or solutions that the board might find? I mean, they've been talking for the past year about we could do this or that.
Well, they already had more cuts that they had to make just to deal with the ongoing impacts of the last big problem.
And just getting done what they did last year didn't fix the whole shortfall. I mean, it was an ongoing
They're borrowing
deficit,
from reserves, and there were other things that they did.
We're getting pretty close to the classroom.
Yes,
Right, at this point,
and there was some concern or uproar really over classified staff losing their job as that gun, and that really affecting students. So there's different pockets and those things did happen last year already. So, and they're going to have to go through that process all over again this year now.
Any final thoughts on this or reporting it, or questions still out there? Good job, Elena, pulling this all together really quickly to bring this to the public. So.
And the board will get a budget update on September 12th at their next meeting. So this, I'm assuming this will be discussed then publicly.
A week and a half from now.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot. That wraps it up for this edition of Behind the Headlines. Please subscribe to us below or give us a thumbs up. You can also follow us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and always check paloaltoonline.com for all the latest news. We'll see you next week.